We have with us today Mr. Michael Paque. Mike is the Executive Director of the Groundwater Protection Council located in Oklahoma City. Mike serves on numerous state and federal advisory committees on topics related to groundwater and oil and gas production and water resources. Mike has Bachelor of Science degrees and Master degree from the University of Wisconsin. Mike, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So you've been working you've been with GWPC since its inception,
right?
Which has been 30 years now.
30 years.
And over that time, obviously things have evolved greatly. Initially, I think most of your focus was in the underground injection control program. More recently, it's into areas like hydraulic fracturing. And the course has already discussed a couple of these topics, the UIC program in particular, and also Frac Focus, the chemical registry that GWPC hosts, along with the IOGCC, the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. Could you give us sort of an update on Frac Focus, where it is today? Because I know it's dynamic in terms of its changes.
The idea for Frac Focus is about 3 or 4 years old. There were a number of state regulatory agencies that make up the governing board of the Groundwater Protection Council. Were talking and discussing oil and gas production, principally gas in some of the shale fields that I'm sure you've talked about. And it was a question asked, wouldn't it be great if we could have a way of providing the citizens and the local landowner a means to find out what chemicals are being used in a hydraulic fracturing procedure down the road or sections away. But there was no way to do it. The state regulatory agencies have always had the ability to find out what those chemicals are. But there was no requirement in any state that the chemicals be listed, simply that they be made available if there was a spill or some kind of a health occurrence, and that they be made available to first responders at a moment's notice. So that chemical information has always been available, but it was also limited to material safety data sheets, which are the sheets, which are the chemicals that are knowingly injurious to human health. After kind of tossing it around a little bit, we decided to go to the industry. Some of our local industries here in Oklahoma City, and some of the operators operating in the Marcellus, Pennsylvania, Bakken, and North Dakota. And we had kind of a, if we build it, would you use it type question for them. Didn't know it was going to be Frac Focus at the time, but simply asked the companies whether or not they'd be willing to voluntarily submit to this website or registry the information regarding the chemicals that were used in hydraulic fracturing. And the answer was somewhat surprising, yes, when can you do it? So with that kind of encouragement, we started working with a number of companies, our state regulatory agencies, a number of environmental NGOs. Environmental Defense Fund has been a part of Frac Focus since its inception. We brought in the Sierra Club, nationally, Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Alliance of Pennsylvania. They remain involved to this day. And again, a number of industries. And we sat down in a 2-day session and asked ourselves if we had a website that the companies were going to use to voluntarily submit this information, what would it look like? And eventually came to an understanding that there would be a internet-based system where any landowner could find information on the chemicals used in a particular hydraulic fracturing procedure. Then we had to ask ourselves, well, what kind of information should that be? What would be valuable? And without going into specifics, and the students can look at fracfocus.org anytime, but a couple of essentials. You need some simple things like who owns the well, what county is it in, what's the API number, and we started adding latitude and longitude, but most importantly, we needed the names of the chemicals that were being used, the name of the supplier, which would be a service company, the name of the operating company, the chemical abstract number, which I think is It's an interesting feature of frac focus, and it was not something we originally thought the industry would even be willing to give us, and we got it. So it's chemical abstract number, and then there's a ratio of the chemical being used in the overall fracture fluid, and then the ratio of that chemical in the overall procedure itself, which includes water and sand. Along the way, we, being state regulatory agencies, we decided that not perhaps as important, but of major importance to the public was not only the chemicals that are injurious to human health, but the environment also. So we added all chemicals, whether they were on MSDS sheets or not. So the requirement for frac focus now is that, and has been for the last year and a half, that the companies then voluntarily listed all the chemicals that were intentionally, keyword intentionally, added in a fracture procedure. And we say intentionally because there's potentially in any given instance something that no one has any awareness of, or a chemical in the water, the makeup water, and we didn't feel like that someone needed to take the pains to list that. So that's simply where it is right now.
It also has the amount of water that was used on a well-by-well basis?
Absolutely. The amount of water, the gallons used. I think that's a key, whether or not it's on federal land or state land, that sort of thing. So if I can give you some dates, this was all in 2010, early 2010. We designed the system on a commitment from the companies, from the major fracturing companies. We designed the system, and it was up and running and beta tested in the late fall of 2010. We continued to beta test into the spring of the late winter and spring of 2011 and went live on April 11th, 2011. And theoretically had 0 wells in the system at that point in time. I don't know, I can give you the numbers on where we are today.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I know I've put up some numbers during the course, but they're probably a little out of date.
I give a talk a couple times a month sometimes on frac focus or a webinar or an interview, and I have to check the figures as fast as I do talks. So let me just glance here at my note. As of this morning, we had 703 participating companies and 540 reporting companies. That lag between them, I think, is an interesting fact. We have 703 companies that have signed up to submit information on frac focus and 540 reporting. The companies are signing up at such a rapid pace that that's us not having time to certify them, to work with them and make sure their data systems are compatible with our data systems. So there's a lag time, but 703 is the important number. We've had about 58,000 fracture procedures. The numbers I'm giving you right now are early November of this year, and I believe we're almost at 60,000 as of today. And of some interest, website visits, pushing 700,000 website visits, and about 430 unique visitors. And that unique visitor is someone that doesn't Google and does a search and ends up on the website, but they're intentionally going to frac focus to get information. So what that tells us, there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of interest, and if the user goes to the website, they can see the chemical information on any given well, list of all the companies that have submitted data and trends and good, really substantial information on the growth of frac focus.
Oh, I know a lot of people have been using the site not only to get information on individual wells, but researchers have used the site to get information, and then they take that information, put it with other information, and publish reports. So it served multiple purposes in terms of increasing transparency when it comes to chemical usage. So right now, I know some states are actually requiring the use of frac focus in their updated rules.
That's true. The first state to adopt frac focus as a rule, a requirement, was Texas, and that was in February of 2012. After that, the states, it was almost like dominoes, Bob. They started coming in. I think Montana was the second state in. Oklahoma may have been third. As of today, we have 14 states wherein it's a legal requirement that you report all chemicals, just in the same wording I gave you earlier, all chemicals intentionally added in a hydraulic fracture procedure. So we have 14 states where it's the law, and be happy to provide you. You may have already provided that information. Major states, Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and then we have 7 states where there's a rule going through the rulemaking process. So when we get those 21 states with mandatory chemical reporting, we believe we'll have covered 99% of all the production in the United States. So we're leaving out, that doesn't count states like Missouri or Tennessee and some of the producing states. And what's also of some interest to note are those states do not require and may never, being small producing states, may never require the chemical disclosure. Again, not suggesting they won't, but the companies, in our observation, have an across a platform requirement by their service companies that, let me use Devon as an example. I talked to the Devon people here in Oklahoma. They have a corporate requirement that if you do business with Devon, and if you sell Devon chemicals to use in a hydraulic fracture procedure in any state, they're agnostic as to what state it's in, other than they have to list it on Frac Focus, you report those chemicals. So they don't have to worry about whether or not it's a fracture procedure in Colorado, Wyoming, or wherever. I might also add that we have 2 Canadian provinces to which we've licensed the use of Frac Focus. British Columbia, which is the license holder, and they have done a sub-agreement with Alberta. We're in final negotiations to issue a license to the it's called the NEB, the National Energy Board of Canada, which is the Yukon and Northwest Territories. And we've also begun talking to the Maritime provinces. So when the NEB gets a license, that will about complete the availability and the requirement in Canada for the reporting of all chemicals. The same standards used in the United States. Some of the nomenclature is a little different. API numbers tend to be used a little bit differently, but we'll have a North America coverage. We've been talking to Argentina, Australia, Germany, Mexico about the use of Frac Focus. All those are in very preliminary stages, but discussions nonetheless. So it's been very successful, beyond anything we thought it would be.
Let me shift gears here a little bit and talk about Groundwater Protection Council's role in coordinating state activities, reviewing state regulations. I know in 2009, GWPC came out with a report that evaluated state agency oil and gas operation rules and regulations. And many people found that to be a very useful report, especially the states, because I think it really instigated a lot of the states to update their rules and regs based on the recommendations that GWPC made in that report. Are you going to be doing an update to that report given the incredible activity we've seen in the last 4 years?
We are. Sometime in the first quarter of 2014, we hope, we'll have an updated version of that report. We have gotten as much activity and requests in our offices for the information in that report as we have almost in Frac Focus. It's absolutely breathtaking. And what that tells me is there is an incredible pent-up demand for information in the oil and gas industry. And the report was called State Rules Designed to Protect Water, State Oil and Gas Rules Designed to Protect Water. And the second report will be an update of that. When the reader goes into that report, they get a comparative analysis of state rules for well construction, pits, siting, pad development, mechanical integrity testing, so we compare all states one to the other, but in a summary form. But the reader also has the ability to go back in an index that's available with it and kind of drill down, pun intended, drill down into the individual state rules to find out the specifics of how things are regulated. We're real excited about that report coming out. And this report will have something that the last one didn't have in it. We've been working with some industry trade associations and the Environmental Defense Fund and, of course, our states to have this a multi-stakeholder report and a review. And the report will contain a number of benchmarks that compare the five unique ways that a state might choose to regulate one part of the oil and gas E&P process. and we'll put those together and list them, and then there'll be a subset of those that talk about which state and where that might be occurring, but without being judgmental, because states, they pass the rules they can pass that's specific to their geology. We want to highlight that. And I think that when those benchmarks are out there, we'll see even greater activity by the states when they kind of mix and match those benchmarks and apply them to their own program. So we're real excited about that.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was the underground injection control program. GWPC really made its mark in helping states with the UIC program over the years, those states that have been delegated authority to implement their UIC program in their states by EPA. Some of the recent issues that have come up with underground injection control of wastewaters, people are concerned about the frequency or the increased frequency of earthquakes in some parts of the country, Oklahoma being one of them. What do you know about, are there efforts underway to revisit some of those UIC rules, regulations, guidance in terms of some of these issues?
I think I can say with a high degree of accuracy that there are if I can discount the, again, it sounds like I'm picking on our small states, but Missouri and Tennessee and Florida Panhandle, but the major oil and gas producing states, I do not know of one state, Bob, that has not done rule amendments, aggressive rule amendments related to hydraulic fracturing, and I'll get to the UIC pieces. I don't know of one state that hasn't done a rule revision in the last 2 years. It's almost frenetic pace for rule changes, trying to keep up with technology, public concern, justified public concern, and the need to regulate differently. Times have changed, and so I think the states have been responsive. It never seems fast enough, but the legislative and rulemaking process and the deliberations are designed to be slow and thoughtful. It's frustrating sometimes, but by comparison to the decade before, it's just again a frenetic pace. As to underground injection, 20 years ago, we actually, when we chartered, we were called the Underground Injection Practices Council, and we worked very closely with the U.S. EPA in those days, and we did a series of reviews, peer reviews, of state underground injection control programs, and this was after the initial installation of UIC programs in the states. It was a very new program. Delegated programs from EPA, the primary authority, through the Safe Drinking Water Act, down to the state agencies. And there are about, for oil and gas now, there are only 5 states that have delegated programs. New York, Kentucky, of the major states, Michigan, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The
states that don't have delegated
do not have delegated programs. So the U.S. EPA runs the UIC program in those states. The Groundwater Protection Council has now entered into a partnership with the U.S. EPA again, and at this time with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. We'll be the principal lead, and we're going to go back and revisit all the primacy states and take a look at what's going on. We have about a 65-page questionnaire that was developed by people that run underground injection control programs in the states and the U.S. EPA. And we involved it's called the UIC National Technical Work Group. It's EPA and state people, and they've vetted this questionnaire. We're going to take that back out to the states and look at kind of a cradle-to-grave look at their UIC program. A couple of significant differences from the earlier version to this one is, number one, we've had many, many years of experience running UIC programs. We're asking a lot more thorough set of questions, I think. But we've also added questions on the origins, the recycling, and then the reuse of produced water, which otherwise would have been injected and may eventually get injected. But what happens between production and eventual injection? There's a lot of reuse and recycling. Tell us about that. What happens to the chemical composition? Does it change any of the regulatory pieces? And I think that's going to be a really interesting finding. The second thing is potential for seismic events. And in the states where that would apply, Oklahoma's a perfect example, probably one of the better ones, and Ohio would be another one. We're going to, and there are others, but we'll go in and we've got a series of questions that will have been developed to deal with how a state, in turn, regulates or works with the operating community to minimize seismic events. So we're really excited about that, and I think we'll see the first of those peer reviews being out in the public, perhaps the first one in the second quarter of 2014. One additional thing we're going to do this time is we're going to look at the states that are regulated by the U.S. EPA. Some of them, like Michigan, have dual permits. An operator applies for a permit with the state of Michigan and essentially the same permit with Region 5, which is in Chicago. And we're going to see if we can't identify some efficiencies in those programs where, and we have a biased view of this now, we are states, where the state might be better off or might be a more efficient way of doing underground injection control, and use this process to accelerate state primacy in those states that I was talking about. So we'll see where that ends up.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for stopping by today and sharing all this information with us. I also want to mention the fact that GWPC was one of the lead groups that produced this book, Modern Shale Gas Development in the United States, a primer. And they have kindly donated enough copies for all the registered students in the class to have a copy. And Mike was the editor of this publication, which has been widely used by states, by the federal government, industry, across the board. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.